Thank you very much for framing the issue in your usually eloquent way, Garrett. Thank you. Our next talk will come from Scott STEELE from the University of Rochester. Scott?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the workshop, which has been exploring a number of critical issues in regulatory science. And what I wanted to highlight briefly was some efforts underway to consider the key elements in a regulatory science curriculum and training program, and perhaps some areas looking forward. I thought I'd start off with some of the gaps and opportunities that we've focused on, particularly around the lack of core competencies to help guide regulatory science training and education programs in this area. And this in part came out from one of the previous IOM workshops that identified this as a critical issue, both for in developing new programs, but also how we might think about integrating regulatory science into a number of existing training programs. I think there's issues around the training pathways, and we talked a little bit about incentives yesterday, and so how to address some incentives for entering training in different stages in one's career path. And then finally, how to leverage some of the networks, which Garrett mentioned at the end of his talk, both through some of the existing consortium as well as public-private partnerships. So just to provide a little bit of context in talking about some of the regulatory science training programs for the work that we've been involved in, we've really focused on the FDA's articulation of regulatory science outlined there, with regulatory affairs being, I guess, a key foundation and pillar for that, and therefore training in regulatory affairs focused more on the current regulations and a number of well-known existing programs in regulatory affairs, with regulatory science really providing an opportunity to drive new research questions and priorities across the medical development pathway, if you will. And Garrett also mentioned the alignment between translational science and regulatory science, and I think these can really be done in a complementary way. In that vein, we've seen some priority areas identified through the FDA strategic plans and joint initiatives between FDA and NIH, particularly around the research priority areas, scientific priority areas, and funding of research projects. But I think in the education and training domain, there's been a less clear articulation of what the training priorities are. Certainly the FDA Centers of Excellence in Regulatory Science and Innovation, the CTSAs, which Russ talked about in kicking off the workshop, have as their remit beyond research, but also education and training. But I think those priorities are continuing to evolve. And one way to really expand the opportunities and network for training in this area, I think, is utilizing the CTSA consortium. So the CTSAs for now at Hopkins, Maryland, Georgetown, and UCSF Stanford, I think there are opportunities to leverage this broader network of CTSAs across the country, with really some shared missions around improving medical product development ultimately, and certainly the CTSAs have a critical role in education and training of future workforce. And to that end, we established about 3 years ago a number of CTSA institutions, along with the original CTSAs, a work group to try to share best practices in regulatory science research and education, and look for opportunities to collaborate, particularly in the education and training realm, as the Maryland and Georgetown CTSAs were establishing their master's programs, still in the early stages, and a number of us at the CTSAs were either had already started developing more formal programs or considering how to integrate regulatory science into our existing training programs, looked for ways to really collaborate on that. And what we had viewed to come back to these core competencies was a real challenge, and as we looked at maybe sharing coursework, looking at areas that could complement our programs, that there was this lack of core competencies or knowledge, skills, abilities we were going to train against, if you will. And so we went through a series of steps to try to develop these core competencies for regulatory science. And one of the areas we identified at the outset was the idea that trainees in this area would likely have existing experience or an advanced degree or perhaps an active research program for those later in their career in one of these key technical areas or priority areas which have been mentioned a bit already, whether in toxicology or epidemiology, social and behavioral sciences, or aligned with some of those research priorities I mentioned from the FDA's perspective, food safety, medical countermeasures development. But the regulatory science curriculum would really complement this existing expertise. And so we went through a process of developing initially in this work group, and I should say some of us had worked on previous clinical and translational research competencies, so use that as a template going forward in developing some broad core thematic areas and then specific competencies associated with each of those, and thinking about a regulatory science curriculum. And after developing that within our group, getting some targeted external feedback, we then did a broader survey to experts in the field. And again, viewing, I just pulled out one example where we have a broader core thematic area, in this case, the regulatory science research questions and priority areas with associated competencies, and did a simple Likert scale to get feedback on are these critical elements for regulatory science training, and also received a lot of broader feedback about training in this area as well, and the value of programs for regulatory science. And with the results of this in hand, we convened a workshop partnering with Joan Adamo and myself from the University of Rochester, Aaron Wilhelm from Georgetown University, and Eileen Cannon from the Pharma Foundation, convened a group from academia, industry, FDA, NIH, foundations, Reagan-Udall, and other societies, and several people in the room participated in this last fall to not only do a final review and an evaluation of the proposed competencies, but also think about more the career pathways for regulatory science and some of the challenges. Just to quickly summarize, what came out of that was this final list of, which we anticipate will continue to evolve, but these broad core thematic areas, and then 3 to 12 specific competencies or knowledge, skills, and abilities associated with those. And many you would expect around regulatory affairs or regulatory policies and process being a key element of that, drug discovery, medical device development, preclinical and clinical trials, and then also some newer areas that really evolved based on some feedback around analytical approaches and tools, some of the areas that came up yesterday around data science approaches and informatics and how to harness some of that data, communications being a key element as well, and then the technology and innovation to really think through the medical product development pathway and the global nature of regulatory science as well, integrated into that area. So the summary from the workshop and then the specific competencies were published earlier this year in Clinical and Translational Science. And one of the other elements I wanted to highlight that came out of the workshop was beyond the core elements in the academic training, that really everyone viewed this experiential training opportunity, or what we call tripartite training, as a critical piece to complement training in regulatory science, both experience, or ideally experience in industry, as well as in the regulatory review. And a number of academic institutions have set up these industry training opportunities, but I think the experience in regulatory review continues to be a challenge, both in I would say from policy, but also just the capacity to set those up with FDA and other agencies. So I wanted to just quickly touch on some of the, not exhaustive, but a few of the existing models for the more formal training programs, just to give us some context. The Georgetown CTSA example, they actually created a regulatory science concentration within their existing masters in clinical and translational research, so utilized their existing CTSA program. Maryland has a fully online program in regulatory science. UPenn has recently developed, in part utilizing some of the competencies, a master's in regulatory science with a distinct regulatory affairs master's, and that requires an advanced degree for the regulatory science program. And at the University of Rochester, we are developing a certificate program, really aligning with some of our existing training programs, utilizing the competencies, and also trying to link it with some of our other training activities to try to develop this internship tripartite training as part of the certificate. So just to sum up, I think with the competencies, we have a mechanism as a template to share across institutions that we might even be able to utilize in sharing coursework, how to integrate some of the case studies and other elements that we would all like to utilize in these programs, and perhaps maybe a certificate or concentration versus a master's, but that's something we can maybe discuss. The tripartite training and trying to integrate that, I think, is a critical element, and utilizing the consortium maybe as a broader training network and disseminating some best practices can have tremendous value. The sustainability and public-private partnerships always remains to be an issue, and how best to engage partners. And I think to tie back to the education and training, I think there's still a bit of a gap in the needs assessment from different sectors on what the real need is and at what level for training in this area. So for that, I'll close. Thank you.